Lone Ridge man cut a fair-haired woman hanging from his roof. With renegade bride burned. Arizona Territory, 1881. Wind bites the eaves like a small saw, and rope creaks over a roof beam, and frost lifts off shingles in a pale breath, and a brand smokes on a pine door, and the letters sit black and cruel, and the woman hangs light as a scarecrow, yet still too heavy for hope, and her boots turn slow, and her hair falls like wheat someone tried to burn and failed. Rowan Hart steps out with a knife and a pail, and he does not draw his pistol, and he sets his shoulder beneath the beam, and he lifts in a hard lean that grinds bone. And the knife saws through hemp and the rope parts with a dry pop, and she drops into his arms like a bundle of wet cloth, and her throat shows a deep, dark ring, and her breath is thin, yet stubborn. And he lays her on the stoop boards, and he tips spring water over the mark, and he holds a rag until the skin cools, and he waits, and he hears nothing but the stove tick and the wind in the junipers. A shot snaps from the ridge, and another answers from the draw, and Rowan does not run to meet it, and he lifts the woman again, and carries her through the threshold, and sets her on a bed near the iron stove, and takes a strip of linen from a box in the corner, and wraps her wrists where rope has burned the skin, and keeps the knot flat so it will not bite, and pours water in a kettle, and sets it on the stove lid, and keeps the fire low so the boil will not jump. Her eyes open, and they are the color of a far cold spring, and she tries to speak, and fails, and tries again, and says, "Do not touch me." And he says, "I will not," and his voice is plain. And she says, "Where am I?" And he says, "A cabin on the east face, that is all." He moves to the door and looks at the brand again, and the door holds a slur that men think is a law, and he does not scrape it and lets it stand for now. And a small step sounds behind him, and he turns, and a boy stands in the gap where the latch never sits right, and his cap is too big, and his hands grip a willow switch, and he looks at the woman like a soldier looks at a flag, and he says, "Do not let them take her," as if the words will hold a wall. And Rowan nods once, and does not ask the boy name, and knows the line of his jaw from a ranch down canyon, and knows the man who rides that brand, and does not speak that either. The woman lifts a hand, and it shakes, and she sets it down, and she looks at the rafters, and then at the stove, and then at Rowan, and her voice is a scrape, and she says, "Who are you?" And he says, "Rowan Hart," and she swallows and fixes on the ceiling, as if a safer sky lives there than any face, and she makes herself say it, and says, "Mira Latham." And he nods, and offers no past, and asks for none, and lifts the kettle and pours a tin cup, and cools a spoonful, and sets it to her lips, and she swallows, and a tremor leaves her shoulders, and the boy steps one pace closer, and holds the willow like a spear, and says, "They will be back at dark." Rowan looks over the boy's shoulder at the timber, and the light lies thin on the bark, and the ridge holds its breath, and he sets the spoon down, and sets the cup down, and draws a breath that tastes like iron and dust and pine pitch, and stands in the doorway, so the threshold feels like a sentry post, and says a single word that is a promise and a plan, and says no. The 6 beats stand, and the day opens like a raw seam ready for work. Light climbs slow over the rock spine, and the stove clicks like a cricket, and Mira breath runs harsh like a saw through green pine, and fever climbs her skin. And Rowan folds a wet cloth and lays it over the rope mark, and breaks hardtack into broth until it softens, and lifts her head and feeds her in little sips with a tin spoon, and waits after each sip, and does not speak, and keeps time by breath, and by the soft ring of iron on iron. Near noon she shakes, and he holds her wrists so she will not claw the wound, and he speaks low, "It will pass," and it does, and sweat leaves her face, and the heat drops, and she sleeps like a child who has outrun a storm. He steps to the spring and fills the pail and checks the lean to where meat keeps cool, and listens to the ridge, and a jay notes him, and flies and hoof marks scar the dust near the lower trail, not fresh, not safe. And he lifts a coil of wire and a handful of tins and strings a circle near the rear door, so any step will sing, and tests it with his boot, and the tins clink like poor bells. When he goes back in, She is awake and sits up slow and sets bare feet on plank and sees the brand on the door and does not cry and breathes out like a smith who struck a bad heat and must start again. And she says, "You should have left me," and her voice holds a flat edge that cuts at herself. And he says, "I do not leave breath on a rope." And she says they will come, and he says then we will work. He moves a peg bucket near the table and sets a knife and shapes a flat of pine into new pegs with a slow clean cut that shows his hand, and she watches and pulls the blanket to her throat and finds a thread and winds it round her finger and then stops as if she remembers she owns her hands. The boy appears at the sill like a shadow that learned to be brave and sets down a cloth bundle and backs away, and Rowan opens it, and inside lies willow bark and a paper twist of salt and a small blue ribbon, and the ribbon holds a knot that says hope. And there is a scrap of writing on a bit of ledger, and the letters shake yet stand. "My name is Jory, I will watch the ridge." Mira touches the ribbon and does not tie it, and sets it near the stove, and looks at boy tracks in the dust and says, "Do you know the men who did this?" And Rowan nods and says, "Barlow Creed runs a spread to the south, and he hires hands who like rope more than wages, and there is a preacher who feeds them words, and a deputy who feeds them nerve, and I know the marks of their boots." She looks at her wrists and at the line around her throat and lifts her chin and speaks the name of a man who is not in the room and says, "I loved a hunter from the high washes, and he taught me to read sign and showed me where the trout lie when sun hits thin, and he was kind, and men who feared that made a word and burned it and tried to hang me on it." And she closes her eyes and opens them and says, "He died last winter." Rowan turns a peg until it smooths like a river stone, and sets it aside and does not touch the past she has set on the table, and tends the fire, and checks the damper, and shows her how the iron stove draws wrong when wind comes down from the notch, and how to set a chip of slate so smoke will go where smoke should go, and she learns and does it herself the second time, so her hands will know. They move into work that holds the mind, and he carries stones to shore the wall behind the bed, and she gathers sage and hangs it to dry near the rafters, and he blends tallow with ash and spreads it along the rope burn in a thin, clean line, and she chews willow bark and swallows, and he carves a comb from a slice of juniper and sands it on hide until it feels like smooth bone, and leaves it on the sill at dusk, and she finds it with first light and sets it in her hair and does not thank him and keeps it, and that is thanks enough. Toward evening Jory comes again and stands at the edge of the yard and does not enter and says, "Men asked for oil at the store, and the man with the brass thimble tied a noose to his horn," and then he adds tonight. And Rowan nods and steps behind the cabin and fills the trench with water until the earth goes dark and heavy, and lays a wet strip along the eaves and checks the tins on the wire and lays a trip line near the second door that only his stride will miss, and slides the old rifle from under the floor and shows the sword trigger to Mira, and she weighs the piece and nods and sets it by the bed, and it is a staff, if not a gun, and her eyes clear and her breath steadies. Night falls, and the ridge goes black at the crown, and the tins sing once in the rear and then go still, and Rowan moves through the second door as if poured by dark, and a man crawls near the trench with a bottle, and Rowan kneels behind him and lays a hand on his wrist and bends until the bottle leaves the hand like a sin that found shame, and he sends the man into the wet ditch with a push, and the ditch does the rest, and the man stands blind with mud and runs, and another shape rises near the pen, and Mira steps from the threshold with the lamp cold and ready, and holds it at shoulder height, and does not shake, and says, "Not this roof," and the shape stops and fades, and the night breathes again, and they sit with backs to the wall until dawn shows a pale rim, and no victory is spoken, and no fear is named, and they stand and make tea and eat bread and move through the day, as if night had been a hard chore now done. Rowan needs salt and flour and a spool of stout thread. He saddles the dun mare. He rides the long cut through lava rock so dust will not tell on him. He ties off at a post that leans. He steps into a store that smells of kerosene and mouse nests and old beans. A bell on a bent wire rings once and dies. The keeper lifts his head. He looks through Rowan as if coin could walk on its own. On the wall a paper hangs with fresh ink on old stock. A bounty for a fair-haired woman who leads men to sin. A line that calls her a thief. A line that names her a stain. The sum is set in neat hand. The bottom edge bears a mark. Not a badge, a ranch brand. A cross laid over a crooked C. Rowan pays for salt and flour and thread. He asks for a sack of oats. He waits. The keeper taps the paper with a finger. He talks like he has been fed on gossip and wants to show his teeth. They say she swings light as straw. Shame about the beam. Rowan takes the sack and turns. A deputy fills the door. His star is bright as a coin. His eyes are young and hard and not wise. Where you ride from? East Face. You got a name? I do. You going to give it? No. The room holds its breath. The deputy looks at the bounty paper and then at Rowan. He squares his shoulders like a boy in a mirror. You seen her? No. You would tell me if you had. No. The deputy laughs with no humor and steps aside. Rowan walks out. The bell clinks and goes dumb. He rides the mare to the spring below the bluff. He lets her drink. He studies the dust on the lower cut. 3 sets of shoes, one with a bar shoe on a bad front foot, a brass thimble mark where a rope swung. He knows the hand that ties that neat. Back at the cabin, Mira has baked flat bread with sour from a crock he kept for years. She has scrubbed the plank floor with sand. The brand on the door still stands. It looks less bold in a clean room, yet it waits. She sets 3 tin cups on the table and does not notice. Rowan does. He does not speak. He lays a small packet on the sill. She opens it. Inside there is a needle of bone and a twist of strong thread. A hair fork of juniper lies with it. She breathes once and sets the fork in her hair and leaves it there. Jory brings a stick of soft spruce and a scrap of paper. He has written 3 names in large letters with a school hand. Barlow Creed, Gage Rudd, Deacon Sloan. He points at the second name with his willow. The man with the brass thimble rides with the first. The third speaks to crowds from a crate on market day. He says words that set dry grass on fire. They fix what can be fixed before dusk. Rowan oils the hinge on the rear door. He bars the front with a new ash brace. Mira lines a trench with fresh sod and makes a small wet garden for Flame to fear. Jory loops his wire and tins and learns the pitch of a bad step. They eat late. They say little. Mira asks a question that is not easy and does not need a long answer. Why do you help me? Because a body is not a brand. Because the dead do not want us to be like the ones who made them dead. She looks at the stove. She looks at the blue ribbon near the kettle. She does not cry. She does not smile. She rises and pours each of the 3 cups. Water, tea, water. She leaves them set. Across the canyon, a rider takes note of the trench and the second door and the damp scar under the eaves. He will tell Barlow that the place is stout. He will say the woman wears no chain. He will say a boy watches from the trees. He will say the man who lives here does not hunt, yet hunts well when pushed. Night eats him, and the day turns. Trouble comes with a snap of wood and a scream of young flesh, and the yearling tangles its foreleg in a split rail at the pen, and the beam twists and the animal thrashes, and if it breaks, there will be no meat next winter. And no coin for salt and fear will carry farther than smoke. Rowan runs with a pry bar and drops to one knee and wedges the iron and bears down, and the rail lifts a hand and hangs, and the calf kicks wild, and Mira slides under the rail like a fox and takes the full weight on her shoulder and holds the head low with one hand so it cannot throw and break its neck, and says easy, and her voice is flat as a plank and does not shake, and she moves the leg free at the breath when Rowan cannot hold, and the bar slips and the rail drops and the calf falls and scrabbles and finds its feet and stands and shakes and lives. Rowan kneels and runs his palm down the leg and feels heat but no break, and nods and looks at Mira, and she is dust to the elbows, and her throat is bruised and dark, and her eyes hold him level, and he gives a small nod that weighs more than speech, and she nods back, and gratitude and belonging pass between them in one clean line. They brace the pen with split cedar and rawhide ties, and Jory holds a nail with small fingers, and the hammer kisses skin, and he doesn't cry, and he says, "We look like 4." Cloud builds over the notch as if the sky sets its jaw, and wind licks the roof and leaves grit, and the tins sing twice and go dead, and Jory slips to his post in the scrub above the rear door, and Rowan checks the trench and finds it wet enough to hold flame, and Mira lays a cloth over the lamp, so light will not show through chink. The men come when the sun steps down behind the ridge, and 6 horses move in a half-moon, and Barlow Creed rides center on a tall blood bay, and Gage Rudd to his right, with a rope loop tight and neat, and a brass thimble gleams in last light, and the man on the left wears black, with a book bound in cracked calf at his saddle horn, and his eyes look like a man who loves pain, yet calls it order, and he is Deacon Sloan. They stop beyond rifle reach and do not call law, and do not raise a writ, and sit and wait for fear to work, and their quiet is a show of power, and Rowan stands in the yard with his hat on, and Mira stands in the doorway, with the lamp dark, and Jory crouches in the brush with a stick, and a courage that would shame most men, and Barlow speaks at last, and his voice carries like a new axe, and he says, "You have a thief," and Rowan says no, and Barlow says, "You shelter a traitor," and Rowan says, "I shelter a woman," and Barlow says, "We will take her," and Rowan says no, and Gage Rudd toys with the rope, and the brass thimble rings soft on the horn, and his grin is wrong. And Deacon Sloan lifts the book and speaks like ink makes him holy, and says sin must be cut from the land. And Rowan does not step back, and does not step forward, and stands like a post that has found bedrock and says, "If you bring a writ, I will read it. If you bring a badge, I will honor it. If you bring rope, you will leave it behind." Barlow smiles without joy and tips his head and notes the trench and the damp roof strip and the bar at the door, and notes the boy in the scrub and pretends not to see, and turns his horse and speaks as if he gives grace and says, "2 days bring her to the square at Slate Crossing, or we come back and take the whole place board by board." They ride off in dust that smells like old blood, and night takes the yard, and the stovepipe lifts a thin thread, and Rowan and Mira stand in the doorway and do not move close and do not move apart, and stand like 2 trees that learn to split a wind. And in the dark she speaks, and her voice is quiet and firm now, and says, "We go to the square. We do not bow. We show what is true." And Rowan listens to the night and hears a small animal in the brush, and hears Jory settle on a root, and sleep in a crouch like a fox, and hears the word on the door, "Breathe hate," and then fall still. And he nods and says, "We show what they do not want seen, and they sleep in shifts." And he sits by the door with the sawed rifle across his knees like a staff, and she sleeps and wakes and kneads dough in the gray hour before dawn, and bread rises, and day comes, and work keeps fear from rotting the will, and this is how they hold. The road to Slate Crossing runs along a dry wash, and then through a stand of cottonwood that hums like bees, and Rowan rides the dun with a sack that holds proof, and Mira rides beside him on a small roan that belongs to no one, and will follow any soft hand, and Jory walks the first mile and turns back with a salute like a soldier who is 12 and has seen too much. The town crouches under a low ridge with a square that is not square, and the store wears a false front that pretends to be fine, and the smith has a cough that rattles, and the chapel has a bell that rings more for show than for souls, and people stand in knots and look and whisper, and the whisper moves faster than truth. Deputy Tom Kersey meets them on the edge, and his badge is dull, and his eyes look older than last week, and he has seen what rope does when a book blesses it, and he nods once, and leads them to a table on a low step, and Mayor Reed stands behind it, with a face that hates trouble most, when trouble is right, and Barlow Creed leans on a post, and Gage Rudd spins the brass thimble on a loop like a child with a toy that kills, and Deacon Sloan holds his book like an axe, and the square hushes. Rowan lays the sack on the table and lifts out a strip of scorched pine that once was a door brace, and the brand on it reads like a scar that learned letters Renegade Bride, and he sets it down and lays a small board beside it that once held invoices at the store, and on it is a note in a hand that slopes sharp, and the ink names a bounty with no court behind it, and the signature is a mark that matches the brand on Barlow flank, a cross over a crooked C. And he speaks in a voice that carries without shout, and says a door was burned with a slur, and a rope was tied to a beam, and no writ was shown, and no court was called, and men rode with a preacher at their flank, and called it law, and he points at the strip, and at the note, and does not point at Mira. A murmur runs like a rat, and Deacon Sloane lifts his book and starts to speak, and Mira steps forward before he can, and unties the back of her dress just far enough to show the rope sign at her throat, and does not tremble, and does not ask for pity, and speaks with a small, clear bell, and says, "A man I loved died in the snow, and he was not your enemy, and he taught me to clean a fish with 3 swift cuts, and to speak to an old woman who baked bread in a lodge that smelled of sage, and I buried him in a wash where juniper grows, and men who feared that love burned a word into a door, and tied me to a beam, and that is the truth." Silence lands like dust and hangs in the air, and the mayor looks at the note, and the deputy clears his throat, and Barlow smiles, and does not look at the brand wood, and looks at the crowd as if it is a herd, and Gage Rudd lets the thimble ring and hush, and ring and hush, and Deacon opens his mouth, and before he can form a line, an old rider pushes through near the smith. Says I was foreman on a drive when Creed first paid for rope, and his voice is rough, not proud, and I quit that day, and I did not stop what followed, and I should have. And his hand shakes, and he points at Barlow and says, "That mark on your flank is on the paper on that table, and it was on the coin you slid across a plank for a hanging at dawn." A woman near the back lifts her chin and holds a child on her hip and says, "I saw them drag her past the ferry, and I did nothing, and I will not do nothing now." And Deputy Kersey steps forward and lays his hand on Gage Rudd rope, and does not draw his gun, and speaks to the mayor, and not to the crowd, and says a bounty set by a ranch with no court is theft with extra steps, and a hanging without a writ is murder with a hymn, and his voice does not shake. And he looks at Rowan and at Mira, and turns to Barlow and says, "You will answer to a judge if we must borrow one from the next town." Barlow laughs, and does not care about judges and cares that the herd might spook, and he reads the faces that once leaned his way and some lean no longer, and he notes it, and steps back from the post, and speaks last, to hold a look of power, and says, 2 days, then we end this in our own way. Rowan lifts the brand wood, and ties it back in the sack, and does not bow, and turns to leave, and feels the weight of eyes, some hard, some soft, and Mira stands at his side, and sets her hand on the sack strap for the length of a breath, and it is enough to say we stand, and they ride out through a drift of talk that has changed and not enough. Dusk finds the ridge, and the porch boards hold the day heat like a small grace, and smoke lifts straight from the pipe and cloth flutters on a line behind the pen, and 3 cups sit on the table and shine in the low light, and a small thing lies on the sill, a carved sprig, and Rowan does not say he made it, and Mira does not ask, and she turns it in her hand, and sets it by the fork in her hair, and the wind shifts, and the tins on the rear wire sing once, and the next step waits at the edge of night. Morning comes thin and bright, and the ridge breathes slow, and Rowan and Mira work as if the day were a fence to set true and tight, and he planes a plank, and she mends his shirt with neat stitches, and he sharpens the draw knife, and she smooths her dress, and the pale road on her throat turns toward living. Jory brings bacon in a seed page and whispers that the deputy watched the store, and the preacher fed talk in the alley, and Hans took oil and nails, and he adds that papers sleep at the chapel house, and a lock means nothing if you know which hinge squeaks. Rowan pockets a small saw and rawhide and hangs the old triggerless rifle like a walking staff and says, "I go slow, I go quiet. I come back and she ties the blue ribbon in her hair. And that is, go and come home." The chapel sits behind a cracked bell wall, and a stout lock guards a door, and a scar on the hinge tells the truth, and a thin wedge and one patient breath open it. Inside smells of oil and hymn and pride, and a ledger waits, and a folded letter with a slanted hand speaks of fire and bounty and shame, and at the bottom sits a cross over a crooked sea and a cheap wax seal with bubbles like a child poured it wrong, and he pockets both and leaves no coin and no noise. A match flares outside, and the shadow of Deacon Sloane turns and coughs and moves on, and the bell rope clicks once, and Rowan slips away by the ditch line so tracks read as water. He reaches the cabin at moonset, and Mira warms milk with sage and hides the papers under the ash brace, and neither asks nor tells, and fear does not turn to talk. At noon they eat in quiet, and Jory dozes on the stoop with a willow across his knees, and wind runs hair from Mira brow, and Rowan shaves the burned word on the door one fibre at a time, until it fades to a ghost and stops, for it is not only his to take. The yearling splashes the trench, and all three laugh, and the world goes back to work. At dusk, a square of linen waits by the comb stitched blue at the edge, with a small carved sprig tied to it, and she binds it to her wrist, and it is little, and it is everything. Night they hang tins on wire, and set the lamp low, and the rifle shadow is a staff by the door, and Rowan listens to the ridge breathe and hears a horse, and a prayer to hate, and returns before moonrise and sleeps by the door like a man who will stand when the bell rings. The day tastes of iron, and a lid of cloud sits on the land, and Mira scrubs boards and kneads dough, and Rowan trims a stone from the mare hoof. Jory brings news with a brave face and says the ferryman was paid to turn riders who ride with them, and the store wall holds a fresh lie that calls Mira thief and names Rowan deserter, and he pins it inside the sack so lies travel with truth. 2 riders come and wait at the yard edge, and one is Gage Rudd with his brass thimble, and the other a near-grown boy with an ash mustache, and Gage says, "Come here," calf to Jory, and the boy does not move, and Mira says, "You will not speak that word on my step," and Gage laughs like a dry latch and offers a trade the boy for the woman for 1 hour, and she says no, and the young rider snatches Jory cap, and Jory lunges, and the loop flashes, and Mira knocks it wide with the cold lamp, and Rowan twists the rider boot and spills him to dust, and Gage sees the wet eaves and the filled ditch, and the woman with a lamp like a stone, and the man who holds but does not strike. And he says 2 days, and rides, and leaves the young fool to run after his horse. Wind storms the roof without rain, and a dead limb breaks a rail, and they brace the gap with stake and shoulder and rawhide, and the fence holds, and they laugh a little because it did. At evening, Rowan says, "I go for the thing that speaks to men who trust money," and he moves by draws and lava shelves and comes to the creed corral, and loosens 2 girths by a finger, and slits a rope hitch so it will fail, and hangs a rat tin with 1 corn kernel to sing at dawn, and at the bunkhouse he hears Sloane, and a weak voice say, "A pewter seal will pass as county if the light is poor," and he studies the crack at 2 points, and a crescent nick, and a handle that runs off true, and leaves it be. At the ferry he pays with words about old deeds, and the man waves him on. Grey light finds bread on the sill, and bacon cold, and Rowan eats standing and says, "The seal has those flaws," and Mira sets them in ink on a blank leaf and folds it with the slanted letter, and the ledger mark, and the 3 cups on the table shine like honest coins. They ride to town, and set eyes to what must be seen, and the keeper looks past, and the smith coughs, and the chapel yawns. On the wall, new letters call her Plague, and him Thief of Souls with a crude lamp and rope meant for easy minds, and Mira lifts a corner and shows an older notice underneath with a smooth, true seal, and the crowd shifts. Deputy Kersey brings hammer and nails and tacks the copy of the ledger and the slanted letter and the line about the pewter crack to the courthouse board, and for a breath truth holds. They buy flour and needles because life still needs both and step into sun, and Jory shows a rope notch on a post. And they see it, and ride home by the wash and gather limbs and onions and mint, and at the ridge Rowan finds small stones lined at a tree, and a note under the last that says, "I come at black sun to take what is mine with a smear of whale oil and blacking like Gage loves." Work keeps fear straight, so he lashes the eaves wet strip, and Mira draws water, and Jory mends a strap, and Rowan trades the nail for a real awl, and the boy stands taller. Before sundown, he fashions a little willow rack, and Mira sets sage and mint on it, and light grows soft. Night comes hot and still, and a careful step crosses the yard, and the tins are quiet, because the step knows how. And Rowan waits by the second door, and a boot brushes the trip line and lifts, and a whisper moves like a moth, and Mira holds the cold lamp and the staff rifle, and Jory takes post by the low stone. 3 shadows slide in, one to the branded door, one to the pen, one to the woodpile, and the rat climbs, and the tin sings, and the first shadow flinches on a bad foot, and the second is Gage, and the third is the preacher, because pride is heavy. Rowan steps into open ground and says, "No more rope here, and not again," and Gage throws the loop, and it bites his own horn because of the cut thong, and the horse leaps, and the lover of rope eats dust. Jory speaks clear from the rock, and names the cracked pewter and the crooked handle, and just then the deputy walks from the trees with 2 men, and takes Gage and Sloane and a rider with a bar shoe and says, "At first light, we end this in the square and no one argues." The square fills and dust hangs and the bell sounds thin, and faces look like men who want rain, and Rowan and Mira ride in with Jory on foot. The mark on her throat is pale, and the blue ribbon holds, and the carved sprig sits by the fork. The deputy lays papers and says the writ seal is false, and shows a borrowed true seal, and reads the ledger copy, and the slanted letter, and the ranch mark on the bounty, and says these are purchases of pride, not words of law. Barlow Creed rides in rich and hot, and calls them breakers, and when he says boys, Jory steps, and says I am Jory, and I am not broken, and the nail of that sentence bites deep. Sloane raises his book and starts his old fire, and Mira steps 1 pace and shows the pale band and says, "I was tied for a word, not a crime, and the man I loved died, and bread with sage is not sin." And the old woman by the smith says, "Let the girl speak," and space opens. Rowan speaks steady and names himself and says he once wore a coat that sent him wrong, and buried honor with wife and child, and swore not to prove worth with iron. And he stands with a rifle that has no trigger, and still stands. And he chooses this woman, and the town may take that or not, but the choosing is done. And he lays the staff, so all can see what is missing. Barlow feels the herd turn, and throws 1 last loop at Mira, and Rowan moves without thought, and the rope rides the staff, and catches on the empty trigger seat, and locks there. And he twists, and the loop drops, and the deputy fires once into sky, and horses shy, and the ferryman catches Barlow rein, and the smith lays down his hammer, and the mayor finds a voice, and says, "Arrest is not a song, but we will sing it." And the men take the foreman, and the preacher, and the boy with ash on his lip, and 2 more who thought rope was pay, and the air cools like metal off the anvil. Dusk drinks the ridge, and the boards keep the day heat, and smoke climbs thin, and the line of cloth moves, and 3 cups shine in a row, and the carved sprig sits like a small bridge, and the herb rack smells of work that stayed. They come home without hurry, and Rowan lifts the bar and does not need it, and leans the staff rifle and does not need it. And Mira fills the flour bin, and lays needles in a tin and hangs her dress on a peg. And Jory stacks wood and ties the blue ribbon to his willow like a flag and says, "I will keep watch." And Rowan says, "You will, and you will eat," and sets 3 cups like a promise. They cook beans with onion and mint and laugh when Jory tells how the rat rang the tin at the right breath, and Mira smiles like a gate set true. And Rowan eyes the shaved word on the door and says, "Not yet," and she nods because some scars must speak before they plane away. He brings a bundle from under the stoop and shows canvas nails, a bent awl, and a charcoal sketch of a porch bench with a back like hills, and says a place for sitting that is not waiting. And she runs a palm over the canvas and says, "We will," and the boy nods solemn as a signer. Night folds clean over the yard, and a coyote calls, and the mare stamps, and quiet returns, and Mira stands in the doorway, and Rowan in the yard with his hat in his hand, and he says, "Stay." And she steps down and sets her hand beside his on the rail and says, "I am here." And Jory curls by the door, proud and asleep. Stars fix to the black like careful nails, and a wind lifts the cloth, and the cups catch the moon, and Mira combs her hair with juniper, and ties the small carved token to the herb rack, so it looks like a leaf that learned to be wood. And there are no words that would improve what they have made, and so there are none. And the house holds, and the ridge breathes, and the end is a steady choice kept each day by hands that work, and the will to stay. In this story, I wanted to hold on to the kind of quiet courage that keeps a frontier straighter than any drill. If this ride spoke to you, please subscribe to my channel Wild Frontier Tales and tap the bell so you never miss new stories from the heart of the Wild West.